Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the Miller Center. Lovely to see you on this gorgeous, absolutely perfect April afternoon. My name is Will Hitchcock. I direct the academic programs here at the Miller Center, and I also teach history here at the University of Virginia. Could I just ask you, I know we always have to do this at the beginning of these things, but if you could drown or otherwise dismantle your cell phone, that would be great. Welcome to the ongoing Historical Presidency Lecture Series. As you know, the Miller Center is an institution that is focused on the study of American political history, American political life, both at home and abroad. And we focus our energies in particular on the history and the functioning and the presence in our politics of the office of the presidency. The lecture series that you're coming to see here today started in the fall of 2013. And our goal in this lecture series has been to reflect upon the history of the presidency, both because we just love the history of the presidency, but also because we look for lessons about the kinds of problems and issues and crises that our current presidents face or may face in the future. This series has brought to the Miller Center some of the nation's absolutely preeminent historians of the American presidency. It has been an extraordinary treat to welcome so many distinguished speakers really working at the absolute top of their game, so to speak, in this lecture series. We've had James McPherson and Gary Gallagher, who started this thing out a couple of years ago, discussing Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. I won't mention all of the great speakers that we've had, but Daniel Walker Howe came to talk about James K. Polk. H.W. Brands came to talk about Andrew Jackson. Joan Waugh came and lectured on U.S. Grant. Alan Taylor on James Madison. We worked our way up through the 19th, and now we're getting into the 20th century. Margaret Macmillan spoke here on Woodrow Wilson. That was quite wonderful. And coming up in the fall, we're going to take on one more shot at Franklin Roosevelt. He gets at least 2 lectures, given the length of his term. Not that we don't trust what Mark has to say. Lyndon Johnson and Ronald Reagan. So we really are covering the presidency from its founding right up to through the 20th century. Now, the format, as some of you know, I think if you've been here before, you'll know what will follow. My colleague Mel Leffler will introduce our speaker, and then after Professor Stoller speaks, the 2 learned gentlemen up here will sit and engage in a bit of a conversation about Roosevelt and his legacy. And then we will open it up to questions. So without further ado, I'll just introduce my colleague in the history department, the Stettinius Professor of American History here at the University of Virginia and a faculty associate at the Miller Center, Mel Leffler.
Well, I'm delighted to be here today and to welcome all of you for part of this ongoing lecture series. We've had, as Will just said, a number of really eminent speakers, including our own Mike Holt, who's here today, who gave one of the lectures last year. And earlier this year, we had one on Woodrow Wilson and one on Herbert Hoover. And when Will told me last year, or asked me last year, if I would organize the series on presidential leadership in times of crisis in the 20th century, I immediately knew 2 things, just instinctively. First of all, that there had to be a lecture on Franklin Roosevelt and the world crisis from 1939 to 1942. We needed to have a lecture that focused on impending Axis aggression, on the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the making of wartime strategy during 1941 and 42 and 43. This was arguably the greatest crisis, or the second greatest crisis in the 20th century. I think the Cuban Missile Crisis ranks up there in some ways, but this was a crisis of huge, huge magnitude. In 1939 and 1940, before Pearl Harbor, policymakers understood that even without a war, even if the United States did not become embroiled in the European War and the Asian War, the United States might have to become, as they often termed it, a garrison state the United States might have to compromise its institutions and its ideals and its values in order to prepare for a possible conflict that might or might not come. Alternatively, if the United States were attacked or if the United States became embroiled in war, the United States during the war might be forced to relinquish its ideals and its institutions in order to wage the war effectively. This was a monumental crisis coming at a time in the late 1930s when the basic institutions and values of democratic capitalism were totally in doubt, totally in dispute. And then there was Franklin Roosevelt, who had earlier in 1933 and 34 struggled to deal with the domestic recovery, and we will have a lecture on that next fall, on the economic crisis of 1933 and 34. And then there was the Franklin Roosevelt, who had to prepare the nation for the possible war and for the development of a wartime strategy in 1940 and 41 and 42. At a time when Roosevelt himself knew in the late 1930s that he was engulfed by political acrimony and partisanship at home. The New Deal had faltered, and economic recovery in the late 1930s was also faltering. Democratic capitalism was really, really in crisis. And so there's no doubt that if you're talking about presidential leadership in the 20th century, a lecture on Franklin Roosevelt is appropriate. The second thing I knew when Will asked me to do this was that the person I wanted to give the lecture on Franklin Roosevelt and wartime strategy was Mark Stoller. Mark actually hasn't written a biography on Franklin Roosevelt, as have many other well-known historians, but Mark is the most accomplished historian of military strategy, Allied military strategy during World War II. He has written 2 or 3 wonderful books about Anglo-American military strategy and coalition warfare in the early 1940s. He's written with great skill and dexterity about the rivalries within the American military services, amongst the chiefs of staff of the Army and the Navy, the incredible acrimony and difficulties between military leaders and the commander-in-chief, President Roosevelt himself. And he's written with equal skill and subtlety about the Anglo-American acrimony, all going on all through the war. So the United States and Great Britain were allies, but its top military leaders were often in bitter controversy with one another, that folks like Franklin Roosevelt, Chief of Staff of the Army, George Marshall, and Dwight Eisenhower, the head of America's expeditionary forces overseas, they had to resolve these Anglo-American conflicts and help shape an effective strategy. Mark has written a wonderful book. I think his best book on this subject is one called Allies and Adversaries, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Grand Alliance, and U.S. Strategy in World War II. But he's also written a beautifully short and thoughtful biography of George Marshall, and has gone on to co-edit several books about Anglo-American strategy during World War II. Mark is also renowned. He spent his career at the University of Vermont. He taught there for many years, and he, I can tell you, has won every possible teaching prize that the University of Vermont has to offer. Significantly also, Mark has been asked to lecture at West Point, the U.S. Naval War College, the U.S. Military Institute, and other such military academies, primarily because among scholars, Mark is known as one of the really eminent people who knows how to integrate military strategy and diplomacy. So Mark was also the president of the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations in 2004 and 5, which reflected his distinction in the field. And so we are very pleased, I am very pleased, that Mark is here today to talk about Roosevelt, strategy, and World War II. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mel. My ears are burning. One thing Mel left out. You have here, in my opinion, the most distinguished U.S. diplomatic historian in the country today, and that is Mel. His work is, I think, utterly brilliant. Mel has also made, I would like to thank Mel for all of this, and I would also like to thank Will Hitchcock, and I hopefully can get this thing going now. I am a Luddite, I am technologically challenged, and I can't even get my stopwatch to go, so that, there we have it, hopefully. No?
Even if you're a Luddite, you can read the
I can read that. All right, we're going to let it go. Okay. Franklin Roosevelt was a very secretive and difficult president to try to figure out. No memoirs, no note-taking during many of the meetings that he held. Story I love, 1942, Secretary of State Cordell Hull wrote to Roosevelt saying, "We have the minutes of the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. Can we publish them?" Answer came back, no. Those minutes should never have been taken in the first place. That is Franklin Roosevelt. Robert Sherwood commented on the, quote, heavily forested interior of the man. An individual who manipulated people, let few, if any, see his innermost thoughts. Whenever I did research at Hyde Park, around this time of day, I would take a break, if it wasn't raining or snowing, and go out and just walk the grounds. I swear I could hear him laughing. No one is going to figure me out. This front of jovial simple-mindedness, and if any of you have been to Hyde Park, that desk filled with every piece of paraphernalia you can think of. Who is this man? What is he thinking? To compound the problem, Roosevelt exhibited different leadership styles at different times. And I discern three during his years as president. First, 1933 to 38, subordination of all foreign policy issues to the domestic crisis that he had to deal with. Then 1939 to 41, strong support for aiding those nations fighting Nazi Germany, but with the use of a very, very cautious style, so as to influence and obtain public support rather than lose it. And then finally, after Pearl Harbor, a very decisive but secretive style in which he became one of the most active and effective war leaders in all of U.S. history. Now, I'm going to try to give you examples of these over the next 40 minutes with a focus via case studies on what I consider two of the most critical times. May 1940 to November 1941, and December 1941 to November 1942. There is a common thread in these two critical time periods, a massive expansion and use of Roosevelt's constitutional powers as commander-in-chief, albeit in different ways. Now, it's not surprising, given the circumstances, that he would use these powers. And I point out to you, when he is inaugurated for the first time, he says he will use those powers to fight the Great Depression. And he hearkens back to World War I and the powers that the executive had and said, I will use it in domestic affairs. And then, as we will see from 1939 on, he will use them in foreign affairs. Now, let me go to the first period. I'm not going to talk about the Great Depression at all. But there is something very important to keep in mind when looking at the period 1933-1938. His leadership is decisive, but on a domestic level, and what that translates into is creating and maintaining a coalition in Congress that will support the New Deal. And that coalition includes many whom we mislabel isolationists. I don't like the term. I think it is a misnomer. I love the crack that Gary Clifford made once, that if you look at this expansion of American power, boy, those isolationists sure do get around, don't they? I prefer the term interventionist and non-interventionist for this particular time period. But in any event, I'll use the term once or twice just because it's the one we are used to. But what you have in the country are very bitter feelings, a belief that our entry into World War I had been a monumental blunder, and one that could have been avoided and should not be repeated under any circumstances. You have in Congress and Senate the Nye Committee investigating why the United States went into World War I. You have the Merchants of Death thesis, and you have the Congress passing a series of laws designed to outlaw the activities that supposedly led us into World War I. These are the Neutrality Acts passed between 1935 and 1939. The belief, false belief, history will repeat itself, and therefore when the next war comes, we will make sure that we will not pursue those actions that led us into the First World War. Well, what? Loans to belligerent powers, they are outlawed. Sale of arms and ammunition to belligerent powers, those are outlawed. Travel on belligerent ships, the Lusitania, that is outlawed. Is it a full embargo? Oh no, oh no. You can buy you can buy food, clothing, etc., not arms and ammunition, if you come over in your ship, put cash down on the barrel, and carry it away in your ship. This is cash and carry. That way, we can make some money out of this war, but we're not going to get our people killed, and we're not going to get sucked in. Roosevelt signs all of these laws because he doesn't want to alienate these people. They will support his domestic policy. He doesn't want to sign them, but he does. He speaks out only once, really, 1937, after the outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War, where he proposes, quote, a quarantine of these aggressor states by peace-loving states. But there is no follow-up to this. It's a trial balloon. He doesn't like the reply he gets. He says nothing. When does it shift? After the last burst of New Deal legislation in late 1938 and the Munich Conference near the end of the year. Because after that, it is clear that war is a distinct possibility. Well, what is he going to do? He will favor a major rearmament program at this time. But he justifies it. When he asks Congress for the money, he justifies it in terms of maintaining a strong defense that will deter the aggressor states and thus enable the United States to stay out of any war that does break out. And in particular, he focuses on expansion of the Navy and the Air Forces, not ground forces. The belief at this time is that naval and air forces are defensive in nature. Don't have time to go into that now, but I'll be happy to if any of you want to talk about it during the question and answer period. I love his quip. He said once, American mothers don't want their sons becoming soldiers, though they don't seem to mind them becoming sailors. Interesting, interesting. Also, Roosevelt in 1939 appoints a new chief of naval operations, Admiral Harold Stark, and a new Army chief of staff, George Catlett Marshall. He appoints Marshall over 33 senior officers, partially because Marshall had had the gall to talk back to him. Roosevelt does not want yes men. So he appoints both Stark and Marshall, and then he does something that I find fascinating. Marshall and Stark sit on the Joint Army-Navy Board. There is no Joint Chiefs of Staff at this time. They sit on the Joint Army-Navy Board, and he moves the board to the new executive offices of the president. Well, what's the significance of that? They will report directly to him, not to the Secretary of War or the Secretary of the Navy. He is establishing a direct line between his highest military officers and the White House. He will try to get Congress to modify the arms embargo. He will fail in doing this until war breaks out. And at that point, Congress does agree to modify it so that Britain and France can buy arms and ammunition as well as food and clothing. But really, there's no major shift in Roosevelt until the spring of 1940. Because what happens in the spring of 1940, if you were living at the time, the impossible happened. Everyone expected that World War II would be a repeat of World War I. They would slug it out, they'd slaughter each other, the Americans would stay out, and they would exhaust each other. That's not what happens. France falls in 6 weeks. And that collapse of France and the Low Countries, which comes as a total shock, leads to a major shift in the attitude of FDR and the American Congress and the American people. For the first time, many Americans begin to say that a hostile and aggressive power like Nazi Germany in control of all of Europe would pose a mortal threat, because Germany would then have the human and the industrial resources to overwhelm both South America and North America, especially if Britain and the British fleet fall. In effect, what you begin to hear for the first time is that American security is dependent upon the British fleet and a European balance of power, not the Atlantic Ocean per se. And that the United States, in its own interest, should help Great Britain to survive this German onslaught. Interventionists who favor this form the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies. That's a wonderful name, if you stop and think about it, under William Allen White. That's formed in May of 1940 to obtain bipartisan support for aiding the Allies. There's a much smaller group, the Century Group, which wants to go further. It wants full U.S. entry into the war in order to defeat Nazi Germany. But as I said, it's a very small group. The anti-interventionists are also still strong. They will eventually form the America First Committee with Charles Lindbergh as their chief spokesperson. They will oppose aid to the Allies as not necessary for the security of the United States and as moves that will inevitably lead the United States into war. What does the public say? Public opinion polls, which Roosevelt reads regularly, are fascinating. Public support for aid to Britain grows during the spring and summer of 1940, and by the fall, 80% of the American people favor aid to England. 60% say such aid is more important than staying out of war. That's 2 times the percentage it was in May. But what about the question, should the United States declare war on Germany? 5% say yes. 95% say no. Is this logical? No. Is this what the public is saying? Yes. And Roosevelt, reading these polls, makes a series of moves in the spring and summer of 1940, not as much as the interventionists wanted, not nearly. And he does it in a very cautious way. What? He replaces his Secretary of War and his Secretary of the Navy with internationalist Republicans who favor aid to England. Henry Stimson, former Secretary of State under Herbert Hoover and Secretary of War under William Howard Taft, becomes the Secretary of War again. Frank Knox, who had been the Republican vice presidential nominee in 1936, Secretary of the Navy. What he is trying to do is create a bipartisan approach to the crisis. He also supports the first peacetime draft in U.S. history, but only when it is introduced by private American private U.S. citizens. He is not going to introduce it. He will ask for the first billion-dollar defense bills in U.S. history, and finally, for an expansion, a small expansion, but still an expansion of Army ground forces, as well as Navy and Air Forces. And he will begin an extended correspondence with Winston Churchill, which started when Churchill became First Lord of the Admiralty when the war broke out, and now expands massively when Churchill, in May of 1940, becomes the British Prime Minister. And then in response to a Churchill plea for naval aid, Roosevelt, by executive order in September of 1950, swaps 50 overage World War I vintage U.S. warships for 99-year leases on British base sites in the Western Hemisphere. He doesn't consult Congress on it. And he gets around Congress by having his chief of naval operations certify that this is a net strategic gain for the country, that you gain more with the base sites than you lose by giving up the old warships. Equally interesting, he is selling all of this to the public as being done for continental and hemispheric defense, not entry into the war. The destroyer bases deal is a classic. Why do you want these bases? To protect the Western Hemisphere. Also, Roosevelt will focus public attention on the Nazi threat to South America. He says they're not going to stay in Europe. They are coming over here. And he echoes the argument of the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies that Great Britain is the first line of American defense, and thus aid to Britain will help keep the United States out of war. Now, why is he doing this? Because those public opinion polls continue to show massive support for aid to Britain, but not for entry into the war. In addition, 1940 is a presidential election year, and Roosevelt has decided to run for an unprecedented third term to deal with this crisis. He gets lucky when the Republicans nominate an internationalist, Wendell Willkie, rather than a non-interventionist such as Robert Taft. But nevertheless, even with Willkie favoring aid to England, Roosevelt will find it necessary to make the famous quote near the end of the 1940 campaign. I've said it once, I will say it again, your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars. And with that, he wins the election. Now, with his victory in November of 1940, his top military advisors and Churchill all decide, okay, he's won the third term, now it's time to level with him. Now it's time to force him to make the hard decisions he has avoided so far. What Churchill does is better known. The plea for more aid, for naval convoys, and a warning that Britain is running out of cash to buy war material from the U.S. Roosevelt's answer? I think some of you know it. Let's remove, quote, the silly, foolish old dollar sign, as he put it. Suppose your neighbor's house is on fire, and he comes to you and says, neighbor, can I borrow your garden hose to help put out the fire? Are you going to ask him for cash on the barrel? Or are you going to give him the garden hose, lend it to him, let him put out the fire, which is in your interest as well as his, and then he'll give the garden hose back to you? And on that basis, he argues the United States must become the arsenal of democracy and proposes Lend-Lease, that the United States lend or lease war material to England. 2 weeks after that, he delivers the Four Freedoms speech in his annual message to Congress, that the American aim should be freedom from want, freedom from fear. Oh God, I just forgot the other two. Want, fear. I just went blank on it. At the Marshall Library, I look at those 4 Norman Rockwell posters every day. But what's he doing here? He is setting up war aims, really, if you stop and think about it, without even being in the war. He argues that Lend-Lease will keep the United States out of the war by keeping the British in. His opponents scream foul and nonsense. Senator Burton K. Wheeler of Montana says Lend-Lease is the New Deal's AAA for foreign policy. The AAA had been the Agricultural Adjustment Act that plowed under every fourth acre. Wheeler says it's going to plow under every fourth American boy. Roosevelt did not exactly like that. I prefer Senator Robert Taft's comment. Lend-Lease, war material, he says, is like chewing gum. Do you really want it back after it's been used? Okay. The military side is Admiral Stark, the chief of naval operations, sends a memo to Roosevelt. It's known as the Plan Dog Memo. Basically, what Stark says to Roosevelt, we need to come up with a global strategy and we need to commit to it now. Nazi Germany is the key menace to the security of the United States, not the Japanese. The Japanese don't have the power, the industrial power, the military power. The Pacific is 2 to 3 times as wide as the Atlantic Ocean. It is Germany. Germany must be defeated, and Britain cannot do it alone. Therefore, Stark says, the United States should begin secret staff talks with the British for a combined global strategy in the event the United States enters the war, a strategy that will focus on defeating Germany first. Roosevelt unofficially agrees by sanctioning the secret staff talks. The historian Louis Martin has argued that this is probably the single most important document in the development of Anglo-American strategy during World War II. While the Congress is debating Lend-Lease publicly, the British and American officers are meeting privately and in tie and jacket, not in their uniforms. And at about the same time that Congress agrees to pass Lend-Lease, the U.S. and British military representatives agree that if the United States enters the war as an ally of Great Britain, their combined global strategy will be to defeat Germany first. These documents, ABC-1 and the revised Rainbow 5 plan. But a key question remains unanswered. How are you going to get Lend-Lease to Great Britain, given the fact that the Atlantic has German U-boats in it? Okay? Churchill wants U.S. naval convoys. That means U.S. entry into the war. Roosevelt says no. Neither he nor the public is ready for this. By this time, support for aid to Britain, even at the risk of war, is up to 70%. But support for a declaration of war is still below 10%. What Roosevelt does do instead is to use his powers as commander-in-chief to gradually expand really the definition of what the Western Hemisphere is and what the defense perimeter of the hemisphere is. When war had broken out in 1939, he had announced a security zone. His critics called it FDR's chastity belt, in which no war actions would be allowed. Well, at first it's 300 miles. Then it's 1,000 miles. 25 degrees west longitude, occupation of Greenland in April as part of the Western Hemisphere. Throughout this entire zone, Europeans are warned not to extend their warfare into this zone. And to enforce it, Roosevelt, as commander-in-chief, orders naval, quote, patrols. The patrols are to monitor German subs. He also will declare a state of unlimited national emergency in May when the German battleship Bismarck breaks out into the Atlantic Ocean. In June, when Hitler attacks the Soviet Union, he and Churchill both welcome Stalin as an ally. Then in July, he argues that Iceland is really part of the Western Hemisphere and occupies it. Warren Kimball, who's edited the Churchill-Roosevelt correspondence, has quipped that this was, quote, creative geography that only popes had ever tried before. Roosevelt also decides to meet with Churchill in August of 1941 off the coast of Newfoundland. The result will be the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter is a statement of combined war aims. It's the 14 points of World War II. The United States is not even in the war. Okay? Churchill returns home upset. He had wanted much more than that. He wanted at least convoys, and if not at least convoys, if not full U.S. entry into the war. Now, Roosevelt still holds back, but what Churchill reports to his cabinet is that Roosevelt said, quote, he would wage war but not declare it, which is exactly what he did a month later, when he announced that the U.S. destroyer Greer had been wantonly attacked by a German submarine, and therefore, as commander-in-chief, he was going to order the Navy to shoot on sight at German subs, and that the United States should help convoy merchant ships as far as Iceland. Okay? What he didn't mention was that the Greer had been trailing the U-boat via his previous orders, reporting its position back to a British fleet, which had been sending out aircraft to drop depth charges on the submarine. Okay? Few facts that I've always thought about. There is a young Texas freshman in Congress who worships FDR, named Lyndon Johnson. And the parallels between the Greer episode and the Tonkin Gulf episode in 1964 are worth thinking about. Roosevelt will also ask Congress, in effect, to repeal the Neutrality Act so he can arm U.S. merchant ships. In November, after 2 American warships are attacked and one is sunk, the Reuben James, with the loss of over 100 sailors, Congress will agree to, in effect, repeal the Neutrality Acts. Now, by this point, the United States is in a shooting war with Germany, clearly. And historians still disagree as to when Roosevelt decided the United States should enter the war, if indeed he ever agreed before Pearl Harbor that victory over Nazi Germany would require full-scale U.S. intervention, as opposed to simply an undeclared naval war to get supplies to Great Britain and the Soviet Union and let them do all the heavy fighting. I'm one of the few who says I don't think he was ever ready for that before Pearl Harbor. My evidence for that is that the Army had come up with the so-called victory program, what it would need to win the war, in September of 1941, in which it called for the creation of an 8.5 million man army composed of about 215 divisions to fight in Central Europe. Roosevelt was very upset with it. He did not accept it. He said it would make a very bad impression on public opinion if it ever got out. Others say no. By the fall, he knew this was going to happen, and he opposed the victory program only because he knew that the public would not like it. So, did Roosevelt lead the public? Did he manipulate the public? Or did he follow the public? Some historians claim that he lagged far behind the public in fear, that he never forgot Woodrow Wilson's losing of public opinion in 1919 and 1920, the rejection of the League of Nations, which also led to Franklin Roosevelt's defeat when he ran for vice president in 1920. Wilson had not paid attention to public opinion. And Roosevelt said at one point, quote, "It is a terrible thing to look over your shoulder when you are trying to lead and to find no one there." Okay? Also, while he's meeting with Churchill, vote on Congress to extend the length of service of draftees in August of 1941 passes by a vote of 203 to 202. One vote, okay? There is also a very close vote over the arming of U.S. merchant ships, 50 to 37 in the House, 214 to 194 in the House. But others say that Roosevelt led and manipulated the public in a very subtle manner. And I love in this regard the comment of King George V to Roosevelt in June of 1941. He wrote that he had been, quote, "struck by the way you have led public opinion by allowing it to get ahead of you." Do with that what you will. Ironically, full-scale and declared war comes only with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, followed 4 days later by the German declaration of war on this country. Now here, Roosevelt appears to have illustrated little, if any, leadership, focusing on the German threat and leaving policy towards Japan's in the hands of the State Department under Cordell Hull. Hull ignores the pleas of Marshall and Stark to avoid provocative action against the Japanese, given the German threat. At one point, he walks into Stimson, says, "I have washed my hands of it, and it is now in the hands of you and Knox, the Army and the Navy." I can just see Stimson saying, "Gee, thanks." The result will be the termination of all trade with Japan, the freezing order in the summer of 1941, which will force Japan either to buckle under or expand into resource-rich Southeast Asia. And that will lead to an attack on the only force capable of stopping them, the U.S. fleet that Roosevelt had sent to Pearl Harbor in 1940 to deter the Japanese from moving into Southeast Asia. As one of my colleagues once put it, Roosevelt seemed to forget that a deterrent is by definition a target. Now, conspiracy theorists argue that Roosevelt was actually very active, knew about the coming Japanese attack, allowed it to happen as a backdoor to war with Germany. I totally reject this interpretation. I think it tells us much more about the people who bring it up every decade than it does about what actually happened. I don't have time to go into it here, but I'll be happy to talk about it during the question and answer period. I will point out one interpretation you might find interesting. That's the historian Waldo Heinrichs, who looked at Roosevelt's actions and saw in them a clear and global, if unstated, geopolitical strategy. The key here was the Soviet Union. Roosevelt realized very early on that the Soviet Union held the key to Allied victory in the war. Whenever the Soviets were doing well against the Germans, Roosevelt's policy towards Japan was mild. Whenever they were doing poorly, his policy was harsh as a way to keep Japan focused on Southeast Asia and the United States rather than attacking the Soviet rear in the maritime provinces and Siberia. It's a theory. As with many things with Roosevelt, solid evidence is very hard to find, but I find it a fascinating one. Okay, enough on entry into the war. Once the United States enters the war, Roosevelt's style changes dramatically and forcefully, and he becomes one of the most active and successful commanders-in-chief in U.S. history. His control of the war effort can be seen at multiple levels, but in my opinion, it is most clearly seen in his policies regarding diplomacy with his allies and military strategy. Two areas in which his powers as commander-in-chief gave him carte blanche, or virtual carte blanche. Now, I've already mentioned the choice of Stark and Marshall, the shift of the Joint Board to the executive offices of the President. Now, in December of 1941, Roosevelt will agree to the formation of the Anglo-American Combined Chiefs of Staff, the British Chiefs of Staff and the American Chiefs of Staff, to run a combined Anglo-American war effort from Washington. That will lead to the creation of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to parallel the British organization on the Combined Chiefs. There were no Joint Chiefs of Staff before 1942. The Joint Chiefs asked for a charter. Roosevelt said, not necessary, meaning they existed throughout the war at his personal discretion. As Franklin Roosevelt Library Director William Emerson once put it, this made Franklin Roosevelt, quote, the sole coordinating link between U.S. military strategy and foreign policy, which is exactly the way he wanted it. In addition to rejecting the charter, Roosevelt for a while rejected the pleas of Marshall for a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was all to be informal and personal. And Marshall said, you need a chief of staff. And Roosevelt said, you are my chief of staff. And Marshall said, no, I'm your Army chief of staff. You need a chief of staff over all your armed forces. Roosevelt's answer, that's my job. I'm the commander-in-chief. And when he finally acceded to the appointment of his old friend, former Chief of Naval Operations Admiral William D. Leahy, in the post of Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief, sitting with the Joint Chiefs, he publicly defined Leahy's task as being his, quote, leg man to the Joint Chiefs, rather than the representative of the Joint Chiefs to the White House. He also refuses to have notes taken during most of his meetings with members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Marshall tried to have a note taker come in with a notepad. Roosevelt took one look at him and said, "Put that thing up." So the next time, he came in with a very, very small notepad that Roosevelt couldn't see, but the writing was so small, the secretary and Marshall couldn't read it. What Marshall would do then, at the end of each meeting, he would immediately dictate to a secretary what had gone on in that meeting. But for Franklin Roosevelt, he and he alone is to be the determiner of U.S. strategy in the war in conjunction with America's allies. For this purpose, he meets 10 times with Winston Churchill during the war, twice with Joseph Stalin, once with Chiang Kai-shek in summit conferences to plan global strategy and to plan a new post-war order. Now, contrary to the traditional view, still somewhat popular, Roosevelt did not simply let the Joint Chiefs run the war on their own. He overruled them more than 20 times between late 1938 and late 1944. He also initiated 13 major military decisions on his own. But he dealt not with his field commanders the way Lincoln did. He dealt with his chiefs. That was due to the global nature of the war, and it was perhaps due to the fact that unlike field commanders like Douglas MacArthur, his chiefs had no political ambitions whatsoever, and they were thus not a threat to him. In fact, George Marshall never even voted. It was a matter of principle with him not to vote. Now, the biggest conflict that went on over strategy was when Roosevelt overruled his Joint Chiefs in the summer of 1942. There was a huge Anglo-American debate over whether to invade French North Africa in 1942, which is what Churchill and the British chiefs wanted, or instead to try to cross the English Channel, either in 1942 or in 1943. The big one was to be 1943. The fancy code name was Bolero Roundup Sledgehammer. Bolero, the buildup of American and British forces in the United Kingdom for Roundup, a massive cross-channel assault in 1943, or Sledgehammer, an emergency operation if the Soviet Union looked like it was about to completely collapse in 1942 with whatever was available. Fearing that if they did not agree with the Americans would turn to the Pacific, the British agreed to this entire plan in April. But then in June and July, Churchill changed his mind, if he ever really believed it in the first place, and returned to North Africa. In July of 1942, Marshall and the new Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Ernest J. King, responded by formally proposing abandonment of Germany first if Britain continued to do this, and a major offensive against the Japanese instead. Roosevelt's naval aide at Hyde Park recalled that Roosevelt, when he read this coming in, just started shaking his head, no, 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 and immediately dashed off 3 handwritten notes that the naval aide then sent. Basically, what he said, I have carefully read your estimate. My first impression is that it's exactly what Germany hoped we would do following Pearl Harbor. Secondly, it does not in fact provide for use of American troops in fighting except in a lot of islands whose occupation will not affect the world situation this year or next. Third, it does not help Russia or the Near East. Therefore, it is disapproved. Roosevelt, CNC. Just in case they didn't get the message. Okay? Then, right after it, I've definitely decided to send you, Marshall, King, and Harry Hopkins to London immediately. I want you to know that I do not approve of your proposal. We'll see you in the morning. As far as Roosevelt was concerned, this was a bluff. He called it a red herring, taking up your dishes and going away, and he knew exactly what they were doing, trying to force the British into crossing the Channel. He was so upset that he even suggested that the record be altered so no one would ever think the United States had considered abandonment of Great Britain during the war. Actually, they had not, but that is a different matter. But what Roosevelt says now is, you are going to London and you are going to have to agree to some offensive operation in 1942. I still prefer to cross the channel, but if the British say no, we will do North Africa together. Why? That's the key. Action in 1942. One, he wants to refocus public opinion on Europe rather than the war against Japan, where it is focused in 1942 in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. Secondly, reassure the desperate Russians. Stalingrad is taking place at this time, especially in light of the fact that he had met Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov in May and June and, quote, promised him a second front in 1942. Third, stifle his domestic political critics who were questioning his military competence in light of all the defeats against the Japanese at this time. There were cries to bring Douglas MacArthur back from the Pacific to, in effect, run the war, take away Roosevelt's position as the war leader. There were even those who were calling for a negotiated peace with Germany. And finally, Roosevelt wanted action to highlight the importance of acting in conjunction with allies in this global war. This was a coalition war. He wanted the public to be aware of that. He once made the crack that his critics wanted to win the war only if A, at the same time Russia is defeated, B, at the same time England is defeated, and C, at the same time Roosevelt is defeated. So for all those reasons, he's going to overrule the chiefs and send his right-hand man, Harry Hopkins, with the chiefs to London to make sure they follow his orders. The result will be the decision to use Anglo-American forces to invade French North Africa in November of 1942, Operation Torch. You were not attacking Germans when you launched that operation. You were attacking supposedly neutral forces of Vichy France at that point. But El Alamein had taken place 2 weeks earlier, the defeat of Rommel, and that led Hitler to decide to send forces into Tunisia so that you would eventually be fighting Germans. Stalingrad occurred later that month, and you mark the major turning point in the war. The Allies are on the offensive from this point on. That and logic similar to the issues of 1942 would lead Roosevelt to support offensives in Sicily and Italy in the Mediterranean in 1943, and to announce in January of 43 at Casablanca the policy of unconditional surrender. There are myths galore about unconditional surrender. There's really nothing new in it. It's the accepted policy of all the Allies. The only thing new is why enunciate it at this particular moment. And again, I'd be happy to go into that. Mel, how am I doing time-wise at this point?
5 more minutes.
5 more minutes, good. That's exactly what I need. Roosevelt then shifted strategically in mid-1943 and insisted with the Joint Chiefs on crossing the Channel in 1944, Operation Overlord. He joined with Stalin at the Tehran Conference to overrule Churchill on this. Churchill wanted to delay further for more activity in the Mediterranean. Now, as Roosevelt dominated and controlled U.S. strategy in 1941 and 1943, so he similarly controlled and dominated U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis its allies and planning for the post-war world, virtually shutting the State Department out. The key concept for Roosevelt was not the United Nations. He's known as the father of the UN. There's an irony in that. Rather, the key concept was his four policemen concept. The alliance is to stay together into the post-war era to prevent Germany from making a third try at world domination. After all, they had done it twice, okay? Why does he agree to the UN at all? What he sees in the public opinion polls is that the public has had a change of heart. God, we blew it in 1919, 1920 by not joining the League. We have a second chance. And he sees a chance to bury isolationism once and for all. So, okay, so we will have a League of Nations, but we will name it the United Nations, which is the name of the Grand Alliance to begin with, and we will put the 4 policemen into the UN via creation of the Security Council. That's what the Security Council was all about. But if you're going to keep the alliance together in the post-war era, that means you have got to have extensive compromises with your allies. Roosevelt had wanted to dismantle the British Empire. Winston Churchill did not want that. He had to give up on that. Joseph Stalin wants to keep the old Russian Empire in Eastern Europe that had been lost at the end of World War I, that he had regained in the Nazi-Soviet pact, and he is not going to let that go. Roosevelt will come under harsh criticism after his death for naivete vis-a-vis Stalin and appeasement of him, especially at the February 1945 Yalta Conference. I reject that criticism completely for many reasons. First of all, Yalta is not a post-war conference. It's a wartime conference. The war is still going on, and the primary reason to have the conference is to figure out how you're going to win the war. Secondly, you want to make sure the Grand Alliance will hold so Germany will not rise again. And that means you're going... Does Roosevelt appease Stalin? Yeah. Did he appease Churchill? Yeah. Did Churchill appease Stalin and Roosevelt? Yeah. Did Stalin appease Roosevelt and Churchill? Yes. Okay? Appeasement became a dirty word after the Munich conference, but it's one of the oldest principles in diplomatic behavior known. And it's also one of the oldest principles known to human beings. When was the last time you appeased a member of your own family, or they appeased you? I'm fighting a losing battle here, but I really would like to bring that word back, okay? Now, does Roosevelt level with the public about what has to happen for this alliance to hold? No. And that's what I would criticize him for. He doesn't. He dissembles. He lies. Because he knows the public is not going to accept power politics. Roosevelt will die in April, just as Germany is collapsing and the Yalta Accords are falling apart. No telling what he would have done had he lived. But what I think we very clearly see here throughout the war years is a leader who paid very close attention to public opinion, who constantly gauged the degree to which he could influence it. Similarly, I think we see a leader willing to use and expand presidential powers as commander-in-chief to control wartime strategy, and a hard-headed realist in international affairs who understood the limits of his own power to control the world. One would not have seen this if one had worked closely with Franklin Roosevelt and just looked at the surface. This front of jovial, simple-mindedness. Stimson once commented that trying to follow Franklin Roosevelt's thought was like chasing a vagrant beam of sunshine across an empty room. You know, they're just bouncing absolutely everywhere. And this front of jovial simple-mindedness. But that's just what it was, in my opinion, a front. And I love the comment that Roosevelt biographer Jeffrey Ward made when he talked about writing a biography of Roosevelt, and the fact that he had a recurrent nightmare at the end of it, that he was playing cards with Franklin Roosevelt, and Roosevelt was talking non-stop, taking Ward's attention away from the card game, and then Ward noticed that Roosevelt was taking cards off the deck and putting them up his sleeve. Ward's conclusion, I think it's safe to say all of Franklin Roosevelt's cards were never on the table. Thank you. I don't believe I couldn't get my...
That was really a terrific lecture, Mark.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you.
Enjoyed it. You covered a lot of territory, and very lucidly. You paint an incredibly favorable portrait of Roosevelt. So I wonder if you might just step back and reflect on whether you see any major failures in his policies during these years from 38 to 43, the years you really focus on. You know, what are the failures that have been emphasized, and why, to what extent do you think certain things should be legitimately criticized, and why overall do you then reject those criticisms, whatever they are?
Okay. The one criticism which I mentioned at the end is the one that I would focus on. And it's easy for me, not running for political office, to say this, okay? I am an educator, but I think Roosevelt had the prestige to educate the public into the realities of the international order. Both 39 to 41, but even more after that. You know, what is the real world here? If we're going to win this war, we have to do it with allies. Those allies have interests that are different from ours. If we want to make sure Germany and Japan don't do this again, we have to try to maintain that alliance into the post-war era, and that's going to mean nasty compromises that we're not going to like, but the alternative may be worse. So I'd say that would be number one. Number two, the secretiveness. The fact that he insisted that all this power be concentrated in his hands, so that when he dies, his vice president doesn't have a clue as to what is going on. There are stories galore about this, that when Harry Truman becomes president, he writes that he felt that the earth, the sun, and the moon had all fallen upon him. When he goes to pay a condolence call on Eleanor Roosevelt, says, "Please tell me if there's anything I can do for you." And she says, "No, Mr. President. Question is there anything we can do for you? You are the one who's going to need the help now." That is not a good way I think, to lead. I also find it interesting that all of this was done in a haphazard, informal manner. And if you look at the National Security Act of 1947, which sets up the National Defense Establishment as we know it today, the Defense Department, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all of it. What that act did, and I only realized this a couple of years ago, in effect, that act legislates everything that Roosevelt did by executive action and makes sure that other people do know what is going on. He's also been severely criticized for doing so little from 33 to 38. There was much more he could have done, but again, look at what his priorities were.
Well, that begs the question, doesn't it? Does it not? Were his priorities correct? Maybe in 33 and 34, yes, with the focus on domestic priorities, but there's people who write on Roosevelt's attitudes and relations with Nazi Germany in the mid 1930s, in 37, 38, 39, are almost strenuously critical of his refusal to educate the American people about the barbarities of Nazi rule, even though it's pretty much agreed that he understood and grasped the barbarities, but simply did not make that a priority. Should he be criticized for that?
I would throw it back out to all of you. When you look at the situation, when you look at the state of public opinion, how far is it safe to go without losing the public? Which is why I gave you those two quotes. I mean, he's terrified of losing the public, and he reads.
But isn't the point? I mean, as you said earlier, that he virtually never tries to lead the public in these years.
That's right.
So during the 1936 political campaign, he gives one speech in the entire campaign that relates to foreign policy, then drops the issue, then gives one more speech, the quarantine speech, and pretty much says nothing until the fall of 1938 about foreign policy.
That is right.
So that just, to say then, as Roosevelt defenders say, that, public opinion didn't allow it, then just for me evokes the question, why did the president not try to lead public opinion during this period of time? Do we know? Some people, what are your views? Because some historians have argued he didn't lead public opinion because he actually shared the view that there was no looming threat to the United States, that things were terrible maybe in Germany, maybe prospectively in Europe, but that it had no bearing on the future of American well-being.
Okay, two things here. Very good. I should have known you were going to nail me. The logic of what I said about Roosevelt at Yalta and Roosevelt at the Allies and the not leveling with the public would lead me to agree with you. He didn't level earlier on. And I realize, though, this is our educator's bias. What we do is try to educate. And the constant fear of not being elected, of losing the public, I think is what holds FDR back. I do not believe, and I know the argument, that he shared the isolationist thoughts. The famous comments, "I have seen war," and how horrible it is. He's an Anglophile, and he does believe, on what level, I don't know, that the future of the United States and the future of Great Britain are bound together in some way. Now, that is based not simply on culture. He's also, remember, he is Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he is a disciple of Alfred Thayer Mahan. So you've got that component of it. And I do think he believed that Britain, France, and the Low Countries could handle things if they could get American arms and ammunition. After the fall of France is when you see him really begin to change, because the world situation has changed. I think there's one other thing to keep in mind about...
So he too is spectacularly surprised by the
so.
fall of France.
Yes.
That's,
yeah, I would say so. He is surprised by it, stunned by it, doesn't quite know what to do for a while. No one does. No one does. One of the reasons Marshall develops this extraordinary relationship with Congress at this time, Congress is hysterical. They are throwing money at Marshall that he didn't even ask for. And he is saying, calm down, I know what we need to do, just give me what I need. And they would give Marshall things that they would never give to FDR. But yeah, I would think so.
There's a lot of tension during this period, 1940-41, actually between Marshall and the president himself,
yes.
right? Because Marshall wants to actually build up American forces. He's the chief of staff of the Army. And alternatively, Roosevelt wants to provide aid to America's allies overseas, including the Soviet Union, after Germany attacks the Soviet Union.
Can I talk about that for you?
Please.
Okay. Roosevelt has two huge hunches that he plays in 40-41 that his Army and Navy chiefs do not share, for good reason. One is that Britain will survive the Battle of Britain, and the other is that the Soviet Union will survive the German attack of June 1941. If you're chief of staff of the Army or chief of naval operations, you can't afford to play that hunch. You have to assume we are going to be attacked. We have to be prepared for it. And Marshall is arguing constantly with Roosevelt over what material stays here versus what material goes to England. The quote that I love, which I think sums it up, is the head of his secretariat, I think it was at that point the then Major Walter Bedell Smith, reports to Marshall that he had just met with Treasury Secretary Morgenthau about selling artillery pieces and ammunition to the British. And he says that if we agreed to sell these to the British and were then found to be lacking these guns and ammunition, you and I might be found hanging from the nearest lamppost. Would it be the American people or the Germans who would be doing the hanging? And I love to point out to my students, you are playing for all the marbles here. And so you've got this constant split of Roosevelt saying, they're the first line of defense, Marshall saying, we cannot rely upon it. Supposedly, Roosevelt had to virtually twist Stark's arm off to get him to say that it was a net strategic gain for the United States to give up the warships for the bases.
I mean, in this sense, those attitudes and decisions really reflect incredibly good judgment by the president himself on making those really tough decisions and saying, you know, it really is important to give aid to Britain, not all of it to American military forces,
Right.
to support the Soviet Union, which had garnered enormous criticism at the time, even within his inner circle.
Yes.
So those were, you know, ultimately, you know, when you judge presidents, sometimes you talk about, you know, the way they interacted, the systems of management they put in, things of that sort. When we think about what you've said here about Roosevelt, there's one might say there's not that much that was exemplary about the way he interacts, the way he sort of deceives the American people. What is exemplary, ultimately, is the incredibly good judgment on many of these issues that he displays, right? But I think there may have been an important issue that he didn't exert such good judgment. And so let's go back. I mean, he was very wise. I think all historians see very wise in terms of accepting the idea, Europe first, Germany is the greatest threat to American national security. But then a whole bunch of scholars have argued, if that's the case, why did he allow the United States to pursue a policy that most scholars view as provocative to Japan? Provocative, that, and many of his military people at the time was saying, if you want to pursue a Europe first, a Germany first policy, you should not be doing the things that the United States is doing. Now, in your comments here, you said, well, Roosevelt just left this to the State Department, you know, just wasn't that important. But it was incredibly important, right? So should we ultimately, should we be critical of the way Roosevelt handled relations in the Pacific with Japan? And here I'm not embracing, you know, the argument. What?
The conspiracy.
The conspiracy argument. I'm really questioning about whether the policy itself, in terms of imposing sanctions, et cetera, against Japan, which many of the military people advised against, you know, was a wise policy.
Yeah. I'll answer you, Mel. I'll give you two answers. The first one is a single word. Yes, I agree with you. But then there's a but. Okay? You have a situation in the Far East where Japan is making war on China, attempting to conquer China, which the United States does not want to see happen, and they're using American oil and steel to do it. Okay? Now, within the State Department, there is a split as to what to do. One side saying, well, if they're doing it with our oil and steel, cut it and force them to back down. The other side, including people very knowledgeable about Japanese history and culture, said they're not going to back down. They will lash out. They will go elsewhere to get the oil and steel, and that means they're going to attack you in order to do it. So what are you going to do here? You're damned if you do. You're damned if you don't in that. Now, at the very end, when it's clear the Japanese are going to move south unless there's an agreement reached, and you know that because you've broken the highest Japanese diplomatic code, not naval code, you know, diplomatic code, which says if you don't reach agreement with the Americans by the end of November, quote, things are automatically going to happen. And everyone knows what that means. And in fact, a war warning goes out from Marshall and Stark at that point. But what are your options? What I sometimes present to class in this is you are trying to tell the American people in November of 1941 that appeasement of Nazi Germany was wrong, okay? And that now you must reject it, and you must fight Nazi Germany at least on the high seas, and maybe further. So are you then going to say, but we're going to appease the Japanese at the same time that you do this? And you can't say, because we don't want a two-front war, though everyone knows that would be the reason to do it. And that is one defense that you could mount of FDR, that he couldn't go in two directions at the same time on something like this. But the other, and the one that fascinates me, is the Waldo Heinrichs thesis, that Roosevelt has a global strategy, that he realizes the Soviet Union is the key, and if he has to keep Japan off Russia's back, given what is going on, and by the way, Moscow is saved by the Siberian troops that Stalin is able to shift, knowing that Japan is not going to attack because it's occupied with the United States in Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific area. This idea that his behavior towards Japan depended on what was happening on the Eastern Front. Now, again, there's no evidence for it except the tough line always when the Soviets are in serious trouble, and the mild line when they're not in serious trouble. And the Eastern Front, we tend to forget, it went back and forth. All the military advisors said, Nazi Germany will cut through the Red Army like a hot knife through butter, 6 weeks maximum. Well, 6 weeks after the war begins, Roosevelt wheels into the dining room whistling, saying, 6 weeks, huh? Take a look. Take a look at what is happening.
Now, what this illuminates is how interconnected all these issues were. I'm going to stop here. There are, I know, many people here who probably have compelling questions. So we have a microphone. Stephanie in the back has a microphone. And we're delighted to take your question.
I'm going to steal the microphone and ask the first question.
Oh, Will Hitchcock. Okay.
Oh, dear. Here we go.
Mark, that's fine. I teach the Second World War survey here at UVA from time to time, and one thing that my students know is Pearl Harbor, and the other thing they know is D-Day. That's about it. This gets a little fuzzy in the middle. You're the great historian of Anglo-American relations in the Second World War, and although we asked you to focus on Roosevelt's leadership, of course, Britain is the central combatant that America has to sustain in those early years. Yeah. Can you just talk a little bit about the weight that Britain played in the Anglo-American relationship, and when did that was the relationship an equal one? Was Britain the senior partner in the relationship? I think most of my students assume the United States won the Second World War more or less without any allies. Yeah. But you've shown that the British actually were sort of important in all this.
Even without the Soviet Union.
I know the Soviets are important, but I want you to speak about the British in this case. Thanks.
50th anniversary of D-Day. I was at the Eisenhower Library and for the celebration, which was wonderful. Sitting next to me was an American veteran who had been a colonel in SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces, Eisenhower's headquarters. He was livid. He was livid because he had been planning with Pentagon officials. Actually, they were the colonels, he said, but I think he was also how to celebrate, okay? Those Pentagon officers thought that SHAEF stood for Supreme Headquarters American Expeditionary Forces. He had to educate them that 3 of the 5 beaches at Normandy were not U.S. beaches, okay? So this, all nations do this. If you would ask most Russians, oh, we fought alone. You ask most British, we fought alone, and they did for a while. Britain really is the fully mobilized power and has a dominant voice in the early years. Yet, at the same time, Churchill is the beggar coming to FDR. And that tends to even it out. I'd say they are equal. After Pearl Harbor, they're equal in 1942 and in most of 1943. If anything, the British are a little bit ahead, and Churchill dominates strategy making, though I would argue he does that by dint of personality. His ability is just extraordinary. But what happens by the end of 43, and the timing is interesting. Britain reaches its mobilization peak in 1943, and it begins to decline. There are just no more men, no more industry, whereas the United States and the Soviet Union are still rising. And by 43, you're hearing talk about the superpowers, okay? When is Churchill overruled for the first time? Tehran, November 1943, the point at which this is happening. Roosevelt and Stalin gang up on Churchill, but they have got the industrial and manpower to back it up. Churchill made an interesting comment right after the Tehran conference. He said, at Tehran, he first realized what a small country Britain was. And the way he put it is, there I sat, on one side of me, the great Russian bear, paws outstretched, and on the other side, the great American buffalo. And in between was me, the poor little English donkey, who was the only one who knew the right way home.
Yes, there's a question over here, sir. Yeah.
You said early on that Russia, or Churchill realized that Russia was the key to victory.
Roosevelt.
I'm sorry, I apologize, yes. During the period from that first 6 weeks of Barbarossa, Kiev later, Moscow by the winter, it must have been pretty gloomy. But what was President Roosevelt doing, if anything, during that period about that gloomy period?
Wait, Roosevelt was, of course, the total optimist. Always the smile, always the upturned face, and realized it was not all gloomy, that at points the Red Army had stopped the Germans, and they were still going. The desperation, you see it in the Joint Chiefs when they realize just how important the Soviet Union is, and they want to throw whatever they've got across the English Channel in 1942, which would have been a suicide mission at that point, but get the pressure off the Russians. Because if Russia goes down, Germany will then be able to control all the human and industrial resources of all of Europe. And the United States simply cannot match that. So you have definitely got that, and Roosevelt continues to say they're going to make it. They're going to make it. So again, the dissembling, by the time he told Molotov that there would be a second front, Marshall was telling him the British were backing out of it. He knew it, and yet he tells, and he says to Churchill, I said it because the Russians are a bit down in the mouth now and need something. Now, I would like to, if I may for just a minute, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of the statistics here, okay? The United States lost approximately 300,000 combat dead during World War II, second highest total for any American war. The Russians had more dead at the single Battle of Stalingrad. The total American death toll is about 405,000. British toll is about the same, a total of about 800,000. The Soviet death toll is between 25 and 27 million. 97% of all German combat casualties before D-Day are on the Eastern Front. Even after D-Day, and here the statistics vary, it's anywhere from 75 to 92% take place on the Eastern Front. But the one that staggered me the most when I read it, when Eisenhower's forces break out of France, the breakout in July and August of 1944, is the same time the Red Army destroys German Army Group Center, the largest offensive of the war. They inflict 900,000 casualties on the Germans. That's dead, wounded, prisoners of war missing. That's 200,000 more than the total number of German soldiers deployed against Eisenhower's armies at that time. You are dealing with war on a completely different level on the Eastern Front.
We probably have time for 2 more questions. Yes, sir. No. Wait, you want to just take the microphone here?
Just a very small question. I grew up in Niagara County, looking out onto Ontario across from Toronto. There's a beach down there called Roosevelt Beach, and it had been apocryphal for years and years that Roosevelt left that beach and went out into Lake Ontario to meet with Churchill prior to the war starting, back in, I would imagine this to be around 1940. Do you know anything about that?
No, to my knowledge, he met with Churchill for the first time off the coast of Newfoundland, Argentia Bay. Now, he did meet with the Canadian Prime Minister at Ogdensburg, New York. And it could be that they first met in the middle of the lake and then sailed over to Ogdensburg. But with Churchill, to my knowledge, Churchill did not cross the Atlantic at all until August of 1941. So I think it may be the meeting with the Canadian Prime Minister that was involved here.
Yes, another question back there.
1939, you said Marshall was appointed the Army and Stark the Navy. In 41, Marshall apparently was re-upped. Stark was over to Hawaii. Why that change?
Okay, what happens, 39 to 41, did you all hear? You know, why the 39 to 41, Marshall and Stark are the Army and Navy chiefs. After Pearl Harbor, Stark is sent to England to head U.S. naval forces, okay? Marshall remains as Army Chief of Staff. Some people say that Stark is removed from office because he's blamed for Pearl Harbor, and if Stark is blamed, then why not blame Marshall for Pearl Harbor? But it's not at all clear that that is the reason Stark is sent to Europe. Unlike the Army, the Navy still had a divided command in 1941. You had the Chief of Naval Operations in Washington, and then you had the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, and that was separate. Roosevelt and others said the two, once we enter the war, the two should be combined. And the ranking admiral, who had been involved in actual war, not war planning, but actually the combat that was taking place in the Atlantic, is Ernest J. King. Supposedly Roosevelt asked him if this was true. He was a mean person, just a nasty person, whose motto supposedly, and he said no, but it should have been, when the going gets tough, they call on the sons of bitches. Roosevelt asked if it was true that he shaved with a blowtorch. And that's what you wanted in command at that point. There's also the fact that Stark was going to a highly prestigious command, the one that Admiral Sims had held in World War I. So don't read this back. Officially, the Army and Navy commanders in Hawaii are found guilty of, they are relieved of command for what they did. The minority report says it should have gone up higher to Marshall and to Stark. This one we can play again and again and again. Marshall and Stark sent out war warnings. I've read the message. Consider this a war warning. I think it's sent out on November 27th or November 20th. Yeah, but not where, exactly. And the one thing we forget is no one thought that the Japanese could pull this off. There had been only one other attack against a fleet from aircraft carriers that had been by the British against the Italians in 1940 using swordfish wooden biplanes to show you how much the technology had changed. And the racism involved, there was a belief that the Japanese couldn't even fly. They couldn't be pilots because of the shape of their eyes. So you are dealing with this, them, they can't do something like that. The distances were huge, and you had seen all the Japanese troop ships moving south, and the convoys going with them. Yeah, you couldn't find the aircraft carriers. They were in radio silence, but Japan had a policy in its fleet of keeping radio silence when you were in inland waters. My interpretation of Pearl Harbor, human error is essentially what happened here. I still think the best book on it is the one that Roberta Wohlstetter did more than 55 years ago.
It's a great book. I'm afraid we're out of time. This has been a really wonderful opportunity. Mark, it was a great lecture, terrific questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. Please come up. Mark's going to be here for a while. Thank you very much.